In the vast Russian countryside, where the forests stretched like endless cathedrals, and the fields rolled in golden silence, a child was born whose soul would never quite rest. The year was 1828, and the place was Yasnaya Polyana, the sprawling estate of the Tolstoy family, nestled some 120 miles south of Moscow. From the outside, it looked like a paradise, acres of orchards, pastures, birch groves, and a manor house filled with the echoes of aristocratic laughter. Yet beneath the polished wood and chandeliers lay a strange mix of grandeur and decay, as though the Tolstoy family itself carried the burden of both privilege and doom. Into this paradox stepped Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, later known simply as Leo Tolstoy, whose name would one day shake the world of literature and philosophy alike. He was the fourth of 5 children, born into nobility but destined never to feel at home within its polished walls. His father, Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy, embodied the charm of a fading aristocracy. An elegant officer of the old guard, remembered for his wit at salons, his debts at gambling tables, and his careless generosity that drained fortunes as easily as it won admiration. His mother, Princess Maria Volkonskaya, came from an illustrious line of nobles connected to generals and statesmen, but she died when Lev was not yet 2 years old. Her absence left a shadow that would haunt him for the rest of his life, for he grew up without a mother's voice, clinging instead to vague recollections and whispered stories from servants. The early years at Yasnaya Polyana were filled with contradictions that sank deep into the boy's imagination. On one hand, there was the comfort of privilege. Marble floors, polished samovars steaming with tea, endless shelves of books, and the sight of peasants bowing to the family carriage as it rattled down dusty lanes. On the other hand, there was the quiet hum of suffering, barefoot serfs trudging across frozen fields, the muffled cough of a servant's child dying in a hut, the grim knowledge that everything the Tolstoys possessed was built upon the backs of those who could never leave the land. Lev absorbed these sights with the wide, solemn eyes of a child already inclined to question, to doubt, to feel shame where others saw only entitlement. Death visited often in those days, as though fate was intent on stripping the young boy of every illusion of permanence. His father died when Lev was just 9, leaving the children orphans under the care of relatives. He would later write that these early losses, first a mother he could barely remember, then a father whose presence had been both comforting and unreliable, planted in him an unshakable awareness of mortality. The world, for Tolstoy, never seemed stable or guaranteed. Every face he loved could vanish, every structure he trusted could collapse. His guardians sent him to live first with an aunt, then another, each new home marked by different rhythms and affections. But Yasnaya Polyana always drew him back. The estate, with its apple orchards and winding paths, became not only the setting of his childhood, but the landscape of his imagination. He would return to it again and again throughout his life, retreating from war, scandal, or the chaos of Moscow society to walk beneath its birches, to breathe its silence, to confront the ghosts of his youth. Yasnaya Polyana was his Eden and his exile, a place of innocence lost and rediscovered, and it remained the anchor of his restless existence until his final days. Yet for all its beauty, Tolstoy's childhood was marked by unease. He was not like other children of his class. While his brothers embraced games, hunts, and noble amusements, Lev turned inward. He scribbled early attempts at stories, stared for hours at the sky, and asked questions that unsettled adults. What happens after death? Why are some born to command while others are born to obey? Why does a God of love allow mothers to vanish before their children can even know their faces? These questions festered like seeds, growing silently until they would one day burst into the sprawling moral landscapes of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Those who knew him as a boy described him as awkward, sensitive, and painfully self-conscious. His large, expressive eyes betrayed emotions he tried to hide. His heavy features made him appear older than his years. He longed for approval, yet feared mockery, a contradiction that would follow him throughout life. In private diaries he began keeping as a teenager, he scolded himself mercilessly for laziness, vanity, gluttony, and lust, as though his soul were already engaged in battle against unseen demons. Still, the boy was not without joy. He loved the countryside with an intensity that bordered on worship. He rode horses across fields, watched peasants sow and reap, and marveled at the cycles of the seasons. Nature, unlike society, seemed honest. A tree did not pretend. A river did not deceive. This reverence for the natural world became a thread that wove through his writing, a silent counterpoint to the artificiality of salons and military parades. Even as a child, Tolstoy sensed that his destiny would not be ordinary. He admired his older brothers, who spoke often of noble causes, secret societies, and the dream of serving humanity. They whispered of a mythical ant brotherhood they would one day form, devoted to virtue and truth. Lev listened with wide eyes, and though he often felt clumsy compared to their brilliance, he carried the idea like a private flame. The belief that life must mean more than pleasure, more than wealth, more than inheritance. But the road ahead would not be gentle. Tolstoy's adolescence would bring him face to face with temptation, failure, and the chaos of a soul unable to accept easy answers. Already, the boy who wandered the orchards of Yasnaya Polyana was haunted by contradictions he could not resolve. Privilege and guilt, faith and doubt, beauty and decay. He was still only a child, yet the restlessness that would define his life had already begun to stir. And as the Russian Empire trembled under the weight of reform and repression, the young Tolstoy, lonely, searching and hungry for meaning, stood at the threshold of a world that would demand everything of him. The question was no longer whether he would find his path, but whether he would survive it. When Lev Tolstoy left Yasnaya Polyana to enter the wider world, he carried with him not only the weight of a noble name, but also the burden of uncertainty. In 1844, at the age of 16, he enrolled at Kazan University, intending to study Oriental languages. The choice was less passion than circumstance, the decision of guardians who hoped to mold him into a respectable servant of the state. But almost from the beginning, Tolstoy's path twisted away from expectation. He was restless, distracted, already at war with himself. Kazan was no Moscow or St. Petersburg, but to a young man raised among orchards and village huts, it was overwhelming. A provincial city bustling with merchants, students in European coats, professors who carried themselves with the air of authority, and taverns where youth drowned its boredom in vodka. Tolstoy entered with eagerness, but quickly discovered that he was ill-suited to the rigid discipline of academic study. Languages proved difficult, and he failed his exams. Professors dismissed him as lazy, unfocused, a boy who dreamed too much and applied himself too little. Yet beneath his apparent idleness burned an intensity few could grasp. Tolstoy kept notebooks filled with grand schemes for self-perfection. He drew up long lists of moral rules: wake at 5, study 10 hours a day, avoid card games, suppress lust, dedicate yourself to virtue. Each day, he broke these resolutions. Each night, he berated himself with savage honesty. Weakness, he scrawled. Cowardice, vanity. Already, the diary became both mirror and whip, reflecting the duality of a soul that longed for purity, yet plunged repeatedly into temptation. For temptation abounded. Tolstoy's brothers and fellow students introduced him to the pleasures of aristocratic youth: late-night drinking, reckless gambling, flirtations with women. He became addicted to card games, often losing more than he could afford, sometimes pawning valuables or borrowing against his inheritance to pay debts. His restless conscience condemned these excesses, yet his body and pride sought them out again and again. The contradiction was unbearable, and he began to see himself as a man divided, a seeker of truth trapped inside a wastrel's skin. By 1847, Tolstoy abandoned the study of languages and switched to law. The subject held more promise, but he remained disillusioned. Professors seemed obsessed with technicalities, with codes and precedents that felt lifeless compared to the great questions gnawing at him. What is the meaning of life? How does one live in truth? Why should one man command another? These were not questions answered by law books, and soon his attendance dwindled. By the spring of that year, he left the university altogether, returning to Yasnaya Polyana in disgrace. Yet failure at Kazan marked not an end, but a beginning. At Yasnaya, freed from professors but chained by self-doubt, Tolstoy threw himself into experiments of moral reform. He devised strict daily schedules, practiced physical labor alongside peasants, and tried to discipline his mind with study of philosophy and religion. He read Rousseau with fervor, calling him his gospel, and attempted to live according to the French philosopher's principles of simplicity and virtue. He dressed plainly, worked the soil, and dreamed of a life stripped of aristocratic excess. But his will wavered. Soon he was gambling again, entertaining guests, and chasing pleasure with the same intensity with which he sought holiness. This pendulum, between asceticism and indulgence, between lofty ideals and earthly weakness, defined Tolstoy's youth. It was as if he could not choose between being saint or sinner, and so he tried to be both. His diaries from these years reveal a young man tortured by his inability to live up to his own standards. He condemned himself for lust, vanity, and cruelty, even as he longed to be a beacon of truth. "I am a lie," he wrote once, the words heavy with despair. But even in these failures, seeds of greatness were germinating. His observations of peasant life sharpened his sense of injustice. His battles with temptation deepened his understanding of human weakness. His endless attempts at reform gave him an intimacy with the contradictions of the human soul that would later animate his novels. Out of his confusion was born a sensitivity that allowed him to portray, with haunting realism, the inner struggles of characters torn between desire and duty. By the late 1840s, however, Russia itself was changing. Whispers of reform, revolution, and unrest drifted even into noble estates. Young men across the empire sought purpose beyond salons and gambling halls. For Tolstoy, this restlessness would soon take shape not in books, but in the army, where his desire for self-discipline and adventure would collide with the brutality of war. The boy who had once drawn up rules for self-perfection was about to exchange the quiet of Yasnaya Polyana for the thunder of cannons and the stench of battlefields. But would war purify him or destroy what little peace he had left? When Lev Tolstoy abandoned the classrooms of Kazan and the disciplined schedules of Yasnaya Polyana, he carried with him a sense of failure that gnawed at his pride. His attempts at self-reform had collapsed under the weight of temptation, and his gambling debts continued to pile. By the early 1850s, he felt restless, adrift, ashamed of his idleness, yet still burning with the desire to become something greater than himself. The answer came not from books, but from the call of the army. In 1851, following his elder brother Nikolai, Tolstoy joined the Russian military. He traveled to the Caucasus, that rugged frontier where the Russian Empire fought its long, bloody war against Chechen and Dagestani tribes, resisting conquest. To the young nobleman, the Caucasus appeared at first as an exotic escape, a land of wild mountains, fierce horsemen, and a beauty both savage and terrifying. Yet the reality of military life stripped away illusions. Tolstoy discovered hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless proximity of death. Here, for the first time, he confronted war not as an abstraction, but as a brutal fact. He witnessed raids on villages, the cries of wounded men, and the eerie silence that followed cannon fire. He felt the weight of boredom punctuated by moments of terror, the endless waiting in camps, the sudden charge of enemies, the shock of comrades falling at his side. And yet, in these very moments, something awakened in him. He began to write. His first sketches of military life, later published as the Cossacks and Sevastopol sketches, were born in the Caucasus. They carried not the pomp of patriotic propaganda, but the raw texture of reality. He described not only battles, but the smell of sweat and smoke, the trembling of soldiers before combat, the confusion of orders shouted in chaos. Readers were startled. Here was no glorification of empire, but an unvarnished portrayal of men caught between duty and fear. In these pages, Tolstoy's voice as a writer began to emerge, clear, unsparing, compassionate, yet filled with moral questioning. In 1854, Tolstoy was transferred to the Crimean Peninsula, where one of the most brutal wars of the century was unfolding. Russia faced an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, and the siege of Sevastopol became its epicenter. The young count found himself in the thick of it, living in trenches carved into mud, shells exploding above, corpses rotting in the summer heat. It was here, amid the suffering of thousands, that Tolstoy's disillusionment deepened. He saw generals issuing commands from safe quarters, while ordinary soldiers bled in the dirt. He saw the absurdity of nationalism, how men who had never met slaughtered each other for causes they scarcely understood. He saw courage and cowardice mingled in every man, himself included. In letters home, he confessed both his terror and his fascination. "War," he wrote, "is not a polite duel. It is the vilest thing in human life, and yet it reveals everything." From these experiences came his celebrated Sevastopol sketches, a series of reports published in Russian journals that brought him sudden fame. Unlike official bulletins, which spoke of victories and honor, Tolstoy described scenes as they were: surgeons sawing off limbs, mothers searching for sons, soldiers weeping from exhaustion. He captured the contradictions of war, the moments of camaraderie and laughter beside the horror of mangled bodies. Readers across Russia recognized the truth in his words. And for the first time, Tolstoy's name was spoken not as a failed student or gambler, but as a writer of power. Yet fame did not soothe him. If anything, it unsettled him further. War had shown him the fragility of life, but it had not answered his questions. Why do men kill? Why do nations destroy one another? Why does death reign so easily over the living? These questions haunted him as he left the front lines in 1855, just before the fall of Sevastopol. He returned to civilian life, marked forever by what he had seen, carrying both pride in his survival and guilt for those who had not. The experience gave him a voice, but also deepened his contradictions. Back in society, he resumed gambling, seductions, and the reckless pleasures of aristocratic circles. He lived as though pursued by demons, squandering money, chasing desire, yet retreating each night to his notebooks where he scolded himself for weakness. His diaries reveal a man at war with his own soul, as restless in salons as he had been in trenches. And yet, the seed of the great novelist was planted. War had taught him to see beneath appearances, to witness the humanity of both victors and vanquished, to strip away illusions of honor and reveal the naked truth of existence. From Sevastopol's mud and blood, Tolstoy carried not only memories, but a method to write life as it is, not as it should be. The soldier had become a writer, the aristocrat a witness, but the restless man remained unsatisfied. He had survived war, gained fame, and returned to wealth, yet the emptiness inside him only grew. Soon he would seek escape again, this time not in the army, but in the far reaches of Europe, where the temptations of high society and the questions of philosophy awaited him. When Lev Tolstoy left Russia after the Crimean War, he was no longer the uncertain boy of Kazan, nor the inexperienced officer of the Caucasus. He was a survivor of battle, a writer with a name beginning to echo in St. Petersburg, and a man consumed by contradictions that gnawed at his soul. The army had given him purpose for a time, but once he shed the uniform, the old demons returned with sharper teeth. Gambling, women, and a restlessness that no salon or estate could satisfy. In 1857, seeking escape and discovery, Tolstoy embarked on a journey across Europe, hoping to find in foreign lands the clarity that Russia denied him. His travels carried him through Switzerland, France, Italy, and Germany, and everywhere he went, he devoured impressions like a starving man at a banquet. In Paris, he strolled through boulevards lit by gas lamps, dazzled by the elegance of cafes, yet sickened by the poverty lurking in alleys. He visited theaters where aristocrats laughed in velvet seats, then walked past beggars shivering on stone steps. The contradiction was unbearable. Once, at a public execution in Paris, he watched the guillotine fall on the neck of a condemned man. The crowd cheered. Tolstoy shuddered. In his diary, he wrote that the sight revealed the true savagery of civilization. The state kills with the approval of its people. That image would never leave him. In Switzerland, he sought peace in the mountains, but his restless mind would not quiet. He saw republics boasting of freedom, yet peasants still bent under poverty. In Germany, he attended lectures by celebrated philosophers, only to dismiss them as men spinning theories detached from the suffering of real life. He admired the discipline of European cities, the punctual trains, the libraries, the universities, but he could not shake the sense that something essential was missing, something deeper than material progress or political order. Yet Europe gave him more than disillusion. It also broadened his horizons. He met intellectuals who debated the future of education, art, and society. He studied Rousseau with renewed passion, convinced that civilization itself corrupted the purity of man. He attended operas and read novels that sharpened his sense of artistic purpose. Slowly, amid wandering and questioning, a vision began to form, that literature was not merely entertainment, but a moral force, capable of awakening consciences and reshaping society. Back in Russia, however, Tolstoy remained torn. His estate at Yasnaya Polyana was both sanctuary and burden. He inherited serfs, lands, and responsibilities that weighed heavily on his conscience. While other nobles treated peasants as property, Tolstoy began to question the justice of the system itself. He spent long hours walking among the huts, speaking with peasants, listening to their songs, their sorrows, their humor. He envied their closeness to the soil, their apparent simplicity, yet he also saw their hunger and despair. He tried to reform his estate, introducing new methods of farming, establishing schools for peasant children, teaching them to read and write. His classrooms were unorthodox. Children sat freely, lessons grew out of curiosity rather than rote, and punishment was replaced by encouragement. Some nobles mocked his efforts, but Tolstoy believed he had glimpsed the seeds of a new Russia in the laughter of peasant children holding books for the first time. Still, the contradictions of his own life plagued him. By day he preached simplicity, by night he squandered fortunes at cards in Moscow. He dreamed of virtue, but indulged in seductions that left him ashamed. His diaries became confessions of a man unable to live the life he prescribed to others. "I am guilty before God and men," he wrote, "yet I cannot stop." The pendulum of his soul swung wildly between idealism and vice, between dreams of saintliness and nights of debauchery. Yet in this turmoil, his writing began to take shape with greater force. Inspired by his experiences in the Caucasus and Crimea, he worked on the Cossacks and other tales that brought him recognition as a writer of rare authenticity. Editors praised his ability to capture not only landscapes and battles, but the hidden tremors of the human heart. Readers felt in his pages the presence of a man who had lived, suffered, and doubted. Not a distant moralizer, but a restless seeker like themselves. It was during these years of wandering and experimenting that Tolstoy's identity as an artist crystallized. He was no longer a dilettante, dabbling in philosophy, or a noble amusing himself with ink. He was becoming a writer of destiny, one whose voice might one day rival the greatest of Russia. Yet the cost of this transformation was high: loneliness, despair, and the growing realization that he could not reconcile the life of a count with the truth he longed to express. Europe had shown him both the heights of civilization and the depths of its hypocrisy. Russia awaited him with responsibilities he could neither embrace fully nor reject. Somewhere between the Alps and Yasnaya Polyana, between roulette tables and peasant schools, between Rousseau's ideals and his own vices, Lev Tolstoy stood on the edge of greatness. But greatness demanded more than impressions and experiments. Soon, he would plunge into the labor of creation, embarking on works that would not only capture Russia, but also the human soul itself. And as he prepared to write, the world outside his window trembled with change. Could literature, he wondered, become a weapon as sharp as the guillotine he had seen in Paris, but used not to kill, but to awaken? By the early 1860s, Lev Tolstoy had wandered through Europe, experimented with education, squandered fortunes, and lived as both a seeker of virtue and a prisoner of vice. But at 34, he stood at the threshold of something greater. The labor that would turn him from a restless noble into one of the giants of world literature. It was not in Parisian salons or gambling halls, nor in the classrooms of Yasnaya Polyana that his destiny would reveal itself. It was at his writing desk, where years of doubt, observation, and suffering would finally converge into creation. The seed of war and peace was planted in the early 1860s when Tolstoy began working on a historical novel about the Decembrists, the failed uprising of Russian officers in 1825. But as he wrote, the story stretched backward, further and further, until it swallowed not only a generation, but an entire epoch. The Decembrists vanished. In their place rose the Napoleonic Wars, the French invasion of Russia, and the grand collision of history and destiny. The scope of his vision became almost terrifying in its ambition. He no longer wanted to tell the tale of a single revolt. He wanted to capture life itself. At Yasnaya Polyana, he immersed himself in archives, reading military reports, memoirs, and letters. He interviewed veterans of 1812, sat for hours listening to old men recall battles long past, and wandered the fields where soldiers had once marched. His notebooks swelled with sketches of characters who would become immortal. Pierre Bezukhov, awkward, searching, and self-critical, an echo of Tolstoy himself. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, noble, disciplined, yet consumed by disillusion. Natasha Rostova, radiant with youth and desire, embodying the beauty and fragility of life. These were not mere figures of fiction. They were Tolstoy's Russia, breathing through ink. The act of writing consumed him. For years, he worked in a frenzy, often discarding entire drafts, rewriting passages until they seemed alive on the page. He described battles not with patriotic thunder, but with the smoke, confusion, and terror he had known in Sevastopol. He wrote love and betrayal with the same merciless honesty with which he examined his own diary. He refused to let his characters be puppets of plot. Instead, he allowed them to grow as people, unpredictable, flawed, and achingly human. When the first volumes of War and Peace began to appear in serial form between 1865 and 1869, readers were astonished. They had expected a novel, perhaps even a historical romance. What they encountered was something unprecedented, a tapestry of history, philosophy, and daily life, woven together with such detail and breadth that it seemed less a book than a living world. Nobles, peasants, generals, and mothers all moved across its pages with equal weight. Tolstoy did not write about history as dates and battles. He wrote about how history felt, how it pressed on individuals, how it broke illusions, how it revealed the fragility of life. The Russian public devoured it. Some saw it as a national epic, a book that gave voice to the suffering and resilience of their people. Others were bewildered by its length, its endless digressions on history and free will. Foreign critics hailed it as a masterpiece, though some complained it was too sprawling, too raw, too alive to fit into neat categories. For Tolstoy, it was nothing less than an attempt to tell the truth of existence, not through abstraction, but through the intimate pulse of human lives caught in the storm of history. Yet even as fame settled upon him, Tolstoy remained uneasy. Success did not bring peace. The applause of readers felt hollow compared to the relentless questions that still haunted him. What was the meaning of all this suffering he had described? Why do men love, kill, betray, forgive? Why do nations rise and fall only for human hearts to repeat the same mistakes? He had poured himself into his work, and yet when he looked at the completed volumes, he felt not triumph, but exhaustion, and the persistent shadow of doubt. Still, War and Peace transformed him. The restless wanderer had become a master, the soldier-turned witness into a prophet of human truth. His fame extended far beyond Russia. European critics compared him to Homer, to Shakespeare, to the greatest chroniclers of human destiny. For the first time, Tolstoy glimpsed that his words might endure beyond his own troubled life, that literature could indeed shape not only minds, but generations. But the journey was not over. If War and Peace revealed the grandeur and chaos of history, his next work would pierce into the intimacy of love, betrayal, and the destruction of a single soul. Having captured the battlefield, Tolstoy would now turn to the bedroom, the ballroom, the kitchen table. And in doing so, he would create another monument, one darker, sharper, and more devastating than the first. For the man who sought truth was never content. No sooner had he conquered one mountain than he turned his eyes to the next. The question remained, could art, no matter how powerful, ever silence the hunger in his soul? After the thunder of War and Peace, Lev Tolstoy might have retreated into the comforts of his estate, basking in glory and allowing his fame to ripen into legend. But Tolstoy was not a man who could rest. Victory always tasted of ashes to him. He looked upon the acclaim with suspicion, convinced that behind every compliment lurked misunderstanding. If War and Peace had captured the sweep of nations, he now felt compelled to turn his gaze inward, to dissect the human heart with a scalpel as merciless as any cannon blast. Out of this urge, slowly, painfully, emerged Anna Karenina. At first, he intended the novel to be a moral tale about adultery, a warning against passion and betrayal. But Tolstoy's characters refused to remain obedient to his plan. They came alive, speaking, weeping, defying him, demanding complexity. Anna herself was meant to be a cautionary figure, but in Tolstoy's hands she became luminous, fragile, and tragically human. Her love for Vronsky burned with a sincerity that readers could not dismiss. Instead of a simple sinner, she was revealed as a woman torn between duty and desire, motherhood and freedom, society and self. Tolstoy poured into Anna all the contradictions he himself wrestled with: temptation and remorse, longing and guilt, the hunger for truth and the shackles of convention. She was no puppet, she was life itself. And Tolstoy, to his own astonishment, loved her even as he condemned her. The novel's pages bled with his own struggles, his own confessions disguised as fiction. Meanwhile, another character took shape, a quieter but equally powerful reflection of his soul: Konstantin Levin, the landowner who wrestled with questions of faith, morality, and the purpose of life. Levin's labor in the fields, his search for authentic love, his despair and eventual flicker of spiritual awakening, these were Tolstoy's own battles, laid bare with raw honesty. Readers recognized it, even if they could not articulate why. Levin was Tolstoy, caught between despair and hope, sin and salvation. The process of writing was torment. Tolstoy revised endlessly, discarding entire drafts, rewriting scenes again and again. He brooded over every sentence, every gesture, as though the fate of his own soul depended on it. At times he despaired that the work would never be finished. Yet in 1877, after nearly a decade of labor, Anna Karenina appeared in full, serialized and then published in volumes. The reaction was electric. Russian readers devoured it, drawn into the glittering salons, the suffocating hypocrisies of aristocracy, the quiet dignity of peasants, and the heartbreaking spiral of Anna's doom. Critics hailed it as the greatest novel of the age, perhaps of all ages. Fyodor Dostoevsky declared it flawless as a work of art. But for Tolstoy, the applause brought little satisfaction. He looked at Anna's fate, her final, desperate act beneath the wheels of a train, and felt not triumph but terror. Was this then all that life had to offer? Desire, betrayal, despair, and death? Was beauty always destined to be crushed by the machinery of society and sin? The success of Anna Karenina coincided with Tolstoy's descent into a personal crisis darker than any he had yet known. His wealth, his fame, his family, all seemed meaningless. He confessed in diaries that he contemplated suicide, haunted by the thought that life itself was void of purpose. "Why should I live?" he asked. "Why should I do anything?" The man who had written epics of war and love now found himself staring into the abyss, unable to explain why existence continued at all. This despair was not hidden. Friends noticed his hollow eyes, his moodiness, his abrupt withdrawal from pleasures that once distracted him. Hunting, drinking, even literature itself began to feel empty. He had scaled the mountain of artistic achievement, only to find no light at its peak, only a chasm opening beneath him. Yet out of this crisis would come the next transformation. Tolstoy, the aristocrat, the soldier, the gambler, the novelist, would soon become something unexpected. A prophet, a seeker of ultimate truth, a man who would renounce the very foundations of the world that had once celebrated him. But before that transformation could take shape, he had to endure the most suffocating years of his existence, years where death seemed like the only honest answer, and where every applause sounded like mockery. For the author of Anna Karenina, life itself had become the cruelest riddle. By the late 1870s, Lev Tolstoy was at the height of worldly success and the depth of inner despair. He had written two monumental novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, works that placed him among the immortals of literature. His family lived in comfort at Yasnaya Polyana, surrounded by wealth and admiration. He was a count, a father, a celebrated author. From the outside, his life looked like triumph. But inside, Tolstoy felt hollow, crushed beneath the weight of questions that no applause could silence. He began to confess, privately at first, then more openly, that he saw no meaning in life. Each day he felt the shadow of death lengthening over him. He wrote in his diary that he was haunted by the thought of suicide, so much so that he hid ropes and locked away his hunting rifle for fear of what he might do in moments of despair. The very act of living seemed absurd. "Why should I write books?" he asked. "Why should I love my children, care for my estate, strive for anything when death waits to devour it all?" This was not a passing melancholy, but a crisis of the soul. He devoured philosophy, searching for answers. He turned to the ancient Greeks, only to find that reason offered no comfort. He read Schopenhauer, whose grim vision of existence as endless suffering mirrored his own fears. He studied science, which explained processes but not purpose. Each book seemed to confirm the same conclusion: life had no meaning, and all human striving ended in the grave. Yet Tolstoy could not accept despair as the final word. Something in him rebelled, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. He began to look not to philosophers, but to the peasants on his estate, the very men and women who worked the fields he owned. They too faced death, hunger, and suffering, but unlike him, they did not contemplate suicide. They lived, prayed, laughed, raised families, and bore their burdens with quiet endurance. What did they know that he, with all his learning and fame, had missed? The answer, Tolstoy realized slowly, was faith. The peasants believed in God, not as a theory, but as a reality that infused their lives with meaning. Their prayers at dawn, their humility in suffering, their trust in a higher purpose gave them a strength he envied. At first, he dismissed it as superstition, a crutch for the uneducated. But the longer he observed, the more he sensed that within their simple devotion lay a wisdom deeper than any philosophy he had studied. This realization tore him in two. On one side stood the rational aristocrat, steeped in skepticism, incapable of blind belief. On the other stood the seeker, desperate for meaning, drawn to the humble faith of peasants who seemed to live with a peace he lacked. His diaries from these years reveal the torment of a man caught between disbelief and longing, ridicule and reverence, despair and hope. In 1882, he published a confession, a raw, fearless account of his spiritual crisis. The book shocked readers. It was not a novel, but a confession in the truest sense. A man of immense fame laying bare his despair, admitting his contemplation of suicide, and describing his slow discovery that faith in God was the only escape from nihilism. Some critics ridiculed him, others admired his honesty, but none could ignore the force of his words. For many, it felt as though Tolstoy had torn the mask off life and dared to stare into its emptiness. Yet his newfound faith did not lead him back to the Russian Orthodox Church in the way some expected. Instead, Tolstoy became increasingly critical of institutional religion. He rejected rituals, dogmas, and hierarchies, which he saw as corruptions of Christ's original message. For him, true Christianity was not about sacraments or icons, but about living the teachings of Jesus: simplicity, humility, love, and non-violence. Anything less was hypocrisy. This conviction radicalized him. He renounced wealth, condemned the privileges of nobility, and began to live more simply, often wearing peasant clothes, working in the fields, and preaching against the very class to which he belonged. His family, especially his wife Sophia, watched with alarm as the Count, who once wrote novels and managed estates, now seemed determined to throw away everything for the sake of spiritual purity. Tolstoy's transformation marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would bring admiration, controversy, and conflict. The great novelist had become a prophet, a preacher of simplicity and non-violence, a man who denounced the church, the state, and the aristocracy alike. He had escaped the abyss of suicide, but in doing so, he placed himself on a path that would divide him from his peers, his rulers, and even his own family. The question was no longer whether Tolstoy could find meaning, but whether he could live according to the truths he now demanded of himself. Could a man, raised in privilege, truly embrace the humility of a peasant? Could a husband and father renounce wealth without destroying those who depended on him? Could the restless seeker ever become the saint he longed to be? By the 1880s, Lev Tolstoy had ceased to be merely a novelist. He had become something far more unsettling, a prophet, a preacher, a man who rejected the very foundations of the world he once inhabited. His crisis of meaning had transformed him. Where once he sought salvation in gambling tables, military ranks, or masterpieces of literature, he now sought it in the radical simplicity of the gospel. Not as preached by priests in golden vestments, but as lived by the barefoot peasants who tilled his fields. He began to live with deliberate austerity. He wore simple peasant shirts, cut his own boots, and worked the land alongside laborers. He condemned private property, calling it a theft from the poor, even as he continued to live in a manor filled with books, servants, and the chaos of 13 children. His rejection of privilege was sincere, but incomplete, and this contradiction tormented him. His wife, Sophia, struggled to manage the estate and family finances, while Tolstoy preached against the very wealth that sustained them. Their marriage, once tender, grew strained, punctuated by arguments that echoed through the halls of Yasnaya Polyana like thunder. Tolstoy's teachings grew sharper with each passing year. He declared that true Christianity demanded non-violence, honesty, chastity, and the renunciation of wealth. He rejected the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church, which he accused of betraying Christ by blessing wars, collecting wealth, and enforcing dogma. The Church, he wrote, is the chief obstacle to true Christianity. For this, the Holy Synod excommunicated him in 1901, branding him a heretic. But to Tolstoy, the judgment of bishops meant nothing. He had already declared his allegiance not to institutions, but to the Sermon on the Mount. His writings from this period, "The Kingdom of God is Within You," "What I Believe," and countless essays, spread across Russia and beyond, carried in secret by admirers who copied them by hand to avoid censorship. In these works, Tolstoy argued that governments were sustained by violence, armies by lies, and societies by greed. He called for radical non-resistance to evil, insisting that violence, even in self-defense, was incompatible with Christ's teaching. His words electrified readers. To the powerful, they were dangerous. To the oppressed, they were hope. Strikingly, Tolstoy's influence leapt far beyond Russia's borders. In India, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi read "The Kingdom of God is Within You" and confessed that it overwhelmed him, shaping his philosophy of non-violent resistance. In America, Christian anarchists and pacifists adopted Tolstoy's teachings as a banner against war and oppression. He had become, unwittingly, a global prophet whose voice carried from Moscow to Delhi to Chicago, inspiring movements that would change the 20th century. Yet for all his fame, Tolstoy remained tormented. He longed to renounce everything, wealth, comfort, even his marriage, but could not. He was trapped between two worlds, the prophet who preached simplicity and the count who remained bound to family, estate, and reputation. His children, especially his wife Sophia, grew weary of his demands for poverty and chastity, seeing them as cruelty disguised as virtue. They clashed bitterly, sometimes in front of servants, their quarrels staining the serenity of Yasnaya Polyana. Tolstoy's inner restlessness poured into stories like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a haunting novella about a man confronting the terror of mortality and the emptiness of a comfortable life. In its pages, readers felt Tolstoy's own fear of death and his yearning for truth. He also wrote parables and fables, simple tales that captured profound truths of peasants, workers, and seekers who found grace not in power, but in humility. His pen had shifted from epics to sermons, from sprawling novels to sharp indictments of society's falsehoods. He became a magnet for disciples. Pilgrims traveled from across Russia to Yasnaya Polyana, hoping to hear the Count who had renounced the world. They found him walking in peasant clothes, speaking of love and simplicity, his beard long and his eyes burning with intensity. Some left disillusioned, seeing the contradictions of his life. Others left transformed, carrying his words like fire. But for Tolstoy, being called a saint was unbearable. He despised the veneration, insisting he was a sinner worse than most, a man who preached what he could not live. His diaries reveal his torment. Lust still troubled him, pride still gnawed at him, anger still erupted in quarrels. He demanded perfection of himself and failed again and again, and this failure nearly crushed him. Still, his voice could not be silenced. In a Russia trembling with revolution, his writings inspired workers, students, and rebels to question authority, to dream of a world without violence or oppression. The state feared him, the church denounced him, but peasants whispered his name with reverence. He had become what he never sought, a prophet whose words were heavier than armies. And yet, the contradictions of his life, the chasm between his ideals and his reality, grew sharper with each passing year. Could a man who preached poverty while living on an estate, who called for chastity while fathering 13 children, truly embody the truth he demanded of others? Or was Tolstoy destined to remain until the end, a man divided against himself? By the dawn of the 20th century, Lev Tolstoy had become both a saint and a scandal. To millions across the world, he was a prophet of love, peace, and truth, a man whose words inspired reformers from Moscow to India. To the Russian church and state, he was a heretic, a dangerous figure whose writings undermined authority. To his family, he was something stranger still, a husband and father whose quest for purity often clashed with the realities of marriage, inheritance, and survival. The Tolstoy household at Yasnaya Polyana became a storm of contradictions. Sophia, his wife of decades, struggled to manage their 13 children, the estate, and the constant flood of visitors who came to see the great prophet. She still loved him deeply, but she could not accept his demands that the family renounce wealth and live as peasants. She copied his manuscripts faithfully, managed his publications, and preserved his words. Yet she watched in despair as he gave away rights to his works, denying their children the inheritance that might secure their futures. Their quarrels became legendary, long, bitter arguments echoing through the manor's rooms, witnessed by servants and disciples alike. Tolstoy, for his part, felt suffocated. He longed to live simply, to escape the burdens of fame, family disputes, and the contradictions of being both count and prophet. He wrote in his diary of dreams to flee, to disappear into anonymity, to live among peasants as one of them. His disciples encouraged this vision, whispering that the world awaited his final renunciation. The pressure grew unbearable. By 1910, Tolstoy was 82 years old, his body frail, his beard white, but his spirit still restless. In the autumn of that year, after yet another quarrel with Sophia over property and publishing rights, he made his decision. Before dawn on October 28th, November 10th in the modern calendar, he slipped quietly from Yasnaya Polyana, taking only a few belongings. He left behind his wife, his estate, and the comforts of nobility. His destination was uncertain, perhaps a monastery, perhaps some humble hut where he could live in silence. What he sought above all was escape. Escape from contradiction, from fame, from the cage of his own legend. His flight shocked Russia. Newspapers carried headlines that the great Tolstoy had abandoned his family. Pilgrims and journalists followed his trail as he traveled by train, weakened and feverish, accompanied by his daughter Alexandra and his doctor. Crowds gathered at stations hoping to glimpse him, as though even in his escape he could not evade the weight of adoration. but his body betrayed him. Somewhere along the journey, at the remote station of Sevastopol, illness overcame him. Fever gripped him, and he was carried into the modest station master's house, where a bed was prepared in a small, cold room. News spread quickly. The greatest writer of Russia lay dying not in his manor, but in a peasant's hut beside the railway. Soon, the quiet village swelled with journalists, photographers, admirers, and police. The house became a besieged shrine, reporters tapping out updates, crowds praying in the snow. Inside, the atmosphere was stark. Tolstoy drifted in and out of consciousness, his once powerful voice reduced to whispers. His family gathered, though Sophia was at first barred by his disciples, who feared her presence would disturb him. She waited outside in anguish, finally admitted only near the end. Their reunion was brief, painful, filled with silences heavier than words. Tolstoy's final days were marked by the contradictions that had haunted his life. He had fled wealth, yet died surrounded by attention greater than any czar. He had sought obscurity, yet his last breath became a public event reported across continents. He had preached peace, yet his own household was torn by quarrels even at the threshold of death. On November 7, 1910, November 20th, New Style, Lev Tolstoy died at the age of 82. Outside the station master's house, snow fell gently. Crowds wept. Priests who had once condemned him now debated whether to honor him, and newspapers from London to New York printed his name in bold letters. He was buried without clergy, as he had wished, in a simple grave in the woods of Yasnaya Polyana, not far from where he had played as a child. No monument marked the site, only earth and silence. For many, his death was the end of an era. For others, it was the birth of a legend larger than life. Tolstoy, the restless boy, the soldier, the gambler, the prophet, had become eternal, claimed by readers, disciples, and nations as their own. Yet the truth was simpler. He was a man who sought meaning with every breath, who failed often, who never stopped doubting, but who turned his struggles into words so powerful they still shake the human heart. Even in death, questions lingered. Had he found the peace he sought, or did the restless spirit of Yasnaya Polyana continue to wander, searching still? When Lev Tolstoy's body was laid to rest in the quiet woods of Yasnaya Polyana, it seemed as if Russia itself paused to listen. No marble monument marked his grave, no clergy presided, no hymns echoed through the trees. Instead, there was only the silence of earth, the rustle of leaves, and the presence of mourners who understood that they were witnessing not the end of a life, but the beginning of a legend. The boy who once scribbled self-critical notes in diaries, the soldier who wrote of the blood and mud of Sevastopol, the novelist who breathed life into Pierre and Anna, had become something more than a man. He was now a voice that belonged to the world. News of his death spread like fire across continents. In Europe, newspapers printed special editions, hailing him as the conscience of humanity. In America, he was remembered as the great moral teacher of our age. In India, Gandhi mourned the loss of the man who had inspired his philosophy of non-violence. Even in Japan and China, intellectuals gathered to discuss his works, marveling that a Russian aristocrat could articulate truths that resonated with peasants and reformers half a world away. Tolstoy's novels became more than literature. They became scriptures of a new kind. War and Peace was read as a hymn to endurance, a reminder that ordinary lives mattered as much as the fates of kings. Anna Karenina became a cautionary tale, but also a profound meditation on love and despair. His later works, once dismissed as eccentric, now seemed prophetic. The Kingdom of God is Within You was translated into dozens of languages, its message of radical non-violence echoing in churches, prisons, and parliaments. But perhaps the most striking legacy was his influence on movements that would shape the 20th century. Gandhi, reading Tolstoy's denunciation of violence, found in it the foundation for satyagraha, non-violent resistance that would one day bring down an empire. In America, Martin Luther King Jr. would later carry the torch further, citing both Gandhi and Tolstoy as guides in the struggle for civil rights. In Russia itself, revolutionaries debated his teachings, torn between his rejection of violence and their own conviction that only blood could free the oppressed. Lenin scorned Tolstoy's pacifism as naive, but admitted that his critique of the state and the church had weakened the old order. Artists too found in him a mirror. Writers like Chekhov, Thomas Mann, and Virginia Woolf studied his prose, marveling at its clarity, its refusal of ornament, its relentless pursuit of truth. Painters sought to capture his image, musicians set his words to song, filmmakers adapted his novels for the screen. To each, Tolstoy represented not only genius but honesty, a willingness to confront life's raw contradictions without disguise. And yet, his ghost was not always gentle. Governments feared his name. The Russian Orthodox Church continued to denounce him, wary of his influence even from beyond the grave. Statesmen worried that his teachings on non-violence and the rejection of authority might inspire rebellion. For decades, his works were censored, smuggled, and read in secret. But censorship only deepened his mystique. The more rulers tried to silence him, the louder his words seemed to echo. At Yasnaya Polyana, his grave became a pilgrimage site. Students, workers, peasants, and travelers from distant lands walked through the woods to stand in silence before the unmarked mound of earth. Some wept, others prayed, still others simply sat in quiet meditation. For many, the simplicity of his resting place was the final proof of his greatness, a man who rejected monuments, power, and glory, and who now lay in the same earth as the peasants he had revered. Yet Tolstoy's true monument was not in the woods of Tula, but in the countless hearts and minds he unsettled. His questions refused to die. What is the meaning of life? How should we live? Why do we suffer? How do we love? His novels did not answer these questions with certainty. Instead, they forced readers to feel them, to carry them, to wrestle with them as he had. That was Tolstoy's gift and his curse. He left humanity not with solutions, but with an unending demand for honesty. As the 20th century unfolded, Tolstoy's presence seemed everywhere, on protest banners, in sermons, in whispered discussions in prison cells. He was invoked by pacifists and revolutionaries, by believers and atheists, by those who sought peace and those who justified rebellion. Few figures in history have been claimed by such opposing camps. Yet this was fitting. For Tolstoy himself had lived in contradiction, forever torn between saint and sinner, aristocrat and peasant, writer and prophet. Even now, more than a century later, his words retain their power. To open the death of Ivan Ilyich is to feel the terror of mortality pressing against the soul. To read Natasha Rostova's Dance is to glimpse the fleeting beauty of youth. To follow Pierre Bezukhov through despair to awakening is to walk the same path Tolstoy himself traveled. And to hear Anna's desperate footsteps on the platform is to know the cost of love in a world that condemns it. Tolstoy's death at Sevastopol ended his wandering, but it did not silence him. If anything, it unleashed him. The voice that once thundered from Yasnaya Polyana now circles the globe, translated into every major language, debated in universities, whispered in revolutions. He is no longer merely a Russian writer. He is a universal conscience, a specter of truth that refuses to be buried. But with such a legacy comes a final question, one Tolstoy himself never escaped. Can humanity ever live up to the truths he demanded? Or will his words remain, like his grave, a silent reminder of how far we have yet to travel? When Lev Tolstoy closed his eyes for the last time in the small station house of Sevastopol, his voice did not fade. It multiplied. The world of the 20th century, turbulent and violent, carried his words like torches into movements he could scarcely have imagined. Though he died in 1910, his shadow stretched across revolutions, wars, and awakenings of conscience, shaping the century as profoundly as any general or politician. In India, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi had already discovered Tolstoy's writings. Gandhi read, "The kingdom of God is within you," as a prisoner reads a key, astonished at its simplicity, transformed by its daring rejection of violence. Tolstoy's insistence that true Christianity demanded non-resistance to evil, that power could be defeated by love, struck Gandhi like revelation. In 1909, Gandhi wrote to Tolstoy, seeking guidance for his experiments in South Africa. The old count, frail and ill, responded with warmth, blessing the struggle and urging him to hold fast to truth without hatred. Gandhi later called Tolstoy the greatest apostle of non-violence of our time and carried his message into India's battle for independence. When Gandhi's satyagraha shook the British Empire, it bore Tolstoy's spirit. In America, decades later, Martin Luther King Jr. studied Gandhi and, through him, absorbed Tolstoy. The marches in Montgomery, the sermons in churches, the insistence on peace in the face of brutality, all echoed the old Russian's gospel of love, stronger than violence. When King spoke of justice rolling down like waters, he was, in part, giving voice to the stream Tolstoy had set flowing from Yasnaya Polyana to the world. Yet Tolstoy's legacy was not confined to pacifists. Revolutionaries too invoked his name, even as they twisted his meaning. In Russia, Lenin sneered at Tolstoy's pacifism, calling it naive, but admitted that his critique of church and state had weakened the foundations of the old regime. Peasants who revered Tolstoy's name joined the early currents of revolution, carrying with them not rifles but dreams of land, justice, and equality. Ironically, the Bolsheviks later claimed Tolstoy as a critic of Tsarism, even while rejecting his rejection of violence. His ghost was divided, saint to some, stumbling block to others. Artists found in him a wellspring. Chekhov admired the simplicity of his prose, though he laughed at Tolstoy's sermons. Virginia Woolf declared that to read Tolstoy was to step into life itself, as though one walked through a forest, feeling everything. Modernists who sought to break with tradition still bowed before the raw honesty of his novels. Painters, filmmakers, and poets drew from his works, whether adapting Natasha Rostova's dance or Anna's final walk on the railway platform. His characters became archetypes, his questions eternal. But Tolstoy's influence was not only artistic or political, it was spiritual. Across the globe, new religious and philosophical movements claimed him. Christian anarchists saw in him a path to reject both church and state. Pacifists embraced his call to renounce violence in every form. Even secular humanists found in his moral urgency a challenge to live authentically. The irony was striking. Tolstoy, a man who could not find peace in institutions, became the foundation for countless movements and ideologies. Still, his ghost was not without contradictions, just as his life had never been. Admirers wrestled with the paradox of a man who preached poverty while born into wealth, who urged chastity yet confessed lust, who rejected authority yet struggled to rule his own household. These contradictions did not weaken his legacy. They made it human, raw, and real. Readers did not find in Tolstoy a saint carved from stone, but a man who failed and rose again, whose struggles mirrored their own. As the 20th century unfolded, Tolstoy's questions only grew sharper. In a century of world wars, concentration camps, nuclear weapons, and revolutions, His insistence on nonviolence seemed both impossibly pure and desperately necessary. His voice echoed like a rebuke across the trenches of 1914, the gulags of Stalin, the battlefields of Vietnam. Could humanity ever live by love, as he demanded, or was violence too deeply woven into history's fabric? In Yasnaya Polyana, pilgrims continued to walk the forest paths to his grave. They came under czars, under commissars, under democrats. They came in silence, in defiance, in hope. They came because in that unmarked mound of earth lay not only a man, but a question. The same question that haunted Tolstoy from his youth to his last breath. How should we live? Even now, the question lingers, whispered in classrooms, in protests, in quiet nights when doubt weighs heavy. Tolstoy does not answer. He demands that we answer for ourselves. And perhaps that is why his voice endures, not as a solution, but as a summons. More than a century after his death, Lev Tolstoy remains alive, not in flesh, but in the trembling urgency of his words. His novels are still read in classrooms across continents, his essays still debated in universities, his spiritual writings still smuggled into places where freedom falters. Few writers have crossed the boundary from artist into prophet, and fewer still have managed to speak with such power to generations he could never imagine. Yet Tolstoy's presence lingers, like the voice of conscience whispering in the dark. In the 21st century, his questions are sharper than ever. Technology has transformed the world, but the problems that tormented him remain: war, inequality, injustice, the search for meaning in a life shadowed by death. When soldiers march into battle, when governments tighten their grip, when wealth towers above poverty, Tolstoy's voice rises again. Why do we kill? Why do we obey? Why do we live? These are not relics of 19th century Russia. They are questions of today, burning with the same urgency he felt as he walked among peasants or watched the guillotine fall in Paris. Readers who open War and Peace discover not a dusty chronicle of Napoleon's invasion, but a mirror of their own lives, the small joys and griefs that persist even as history roars around them. Those who open Anna Karenina find not only a tale of forbidden love, but the terror of being crushed by society's cold judgment. Those who open The Death of Ivan Ilyich feel the same shiver Tolstoy once felt as he faced the void and asked whether life itself has meaning. His stories are not about Russia. They are about humanity, about the fragile, flickering light that endures even in despair. Beyond literature, his spiritual legacy remains fierce. Gandhi's torch of nonviolence, passed to Martin Luther King Jr., still illuminates movements for justice. Environmentalists cite Tolstoy's warnings about the disconnection between man and nature, his reverence for the soil, his call to live simply. Pacifists cling to his radical gospel of love as armies march and bombs fall. Even those who reject faith entirely find in him not doctrine, but honesty. The refusal to look away from life's most terrifying questions. And yet, Tolstoy's contradictions endure as well. He remains both prophet and sinner, saint and skeptic, peasant and count. Admirers see in him a beacon, critics see hypocrisy. Perhaps both are right. For Tolstoy's greatness lies not in perfection, but in struggle. He was a man who never ceased to wrestle with himself, whose failures became as instructive as his triumphs. His diaries show us a soul unmasked, proud, lustful, vain, repentant, endlessly seeking. In that restless humanity lies his power, because he was never a marble statue, but a man of flesh and doubt like us. At Yasnaya Polyana, his grave remains unmarked, covered only by grass and silence. Pilgrims still walk the wooded path to stand before it, some in reverence, others in curiosity. They find no monument, no inscription, only earth. And yet that simplicity is his truest memorial. Tolstoy needed no stone to bear his name. His monument is written in the millions of pages still turning in hands across the world, in the protests that march without violence, in the questions whispered at midnight when certainty collapses. Lev Tolstoy sought truth in war, in love, in despair, in faith, and in failure. He never found a final answer. Perhaps that was the point. He left us not solutions, but the courage to face the abyss without flinching, to live honestly, to love fiercely, to question endlessly. His voice endures because it is not a sermon from on high, but a cry from the heart of a man who could not accept lies, not from rulers, not from priests, not even from himself. And so the restless boy of Yasnaya Polyana, the soldier of Sevastopol, the prophet of non-violence, the exile who fled his own home, still walks among us. He is in every page where history trembles, in every story where love defies convention, in every silence where death presses near. Tolstoy does not tell us what to believe. He demands that we believe something. He does not promise peace. He calls us to struggle. He does not give us certainty. He gives us the unbearable, necessary burden of truth, and in that burden, his immortality lives.